So welcome. I am Mariana Mazzucato. I'm the director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And this is a whole series of talks. This is the second one in the series where we're trying to explore the relationship between innovation and the welfare state, which are usually two concepts that are kind of not so much juxtaposed, but you don't kind of put them together. There's this assumption that innovation is created in one part of the economy. The Silicon Valley types of economies are here. What do they call it? Silicon Roundabout. So innovation, entrepreneurship, risk-taking. And then there's this big, clunky, bureaucratic, but useful thing called the welfare state, right? Which gives us access to all these fundamentally important things like healthcare, education, pensions, sustainable cities. So the issue is this a completely false dichotomy? And how can we change our ways of thinking? Could it actually be, for example, that how we structure and reimagine the welfare state and the key services that it provides to citizens can be a funnel, a tunnel, a tentacle through which innovation happens. It helps, if you want, direct innovation. And this is really important for us at IIPP, the institute which I direct at UCL, because for us, we kind of begin with this premise that markets themselves are outcomes of how public, private, third sector organizations come together. Innovation and economic growth have not just a rate, but a direction. But how that direction is set, who's at the table talking about it really matters. So to give you an example, with all this discussion now about climate change, these students and children actually are out in the streets like Greta from Sweden fighting for that. And trade unions are there kind of talking about the just transition. In other words, once we transition to a cleaner economy, what's going to happen to workers who are in some ways dismissed from a dirty economy to a clean economy? And one question would be, where are the trade unions at the table in the first place defining that green transition instead of just reacting to it? So how we imagine or reimagine a space fundamentally depends on who's at the table discussing it. So this is very much at the center of this whole series that we're running, and this is just a second. You all should have a flyer on your seat. I see you're all sitting on a seat. You might be sitting on the flyer, so make sure you're not on all the different talks that will be in the series, as well as a brochure on what we're trying to do in the Institute, which is actually a department at UCL. And by that I mean we have our own training program. For us, this isn't just about better policies, better welfare state policies, it's also about new mindsets. So I'm also very happy, as I'll introduce Hilary in a minute, she's also joined us as one of our honorary professors, rethinking the curriculum, the training of the dynamic bureaucrats of the future. Anyway, so we are extremely happy to be hosting this with the British Library. So Rolly Keating will also be chairing some of the sessions. He's the CEO of the British Library. Rainer Cattell, who's sitting there, the deputy director, he will also be chairing some of the sessions that you'll see. So let me introduce our guests, and I should also say that we're going to be running this as a conversation. This isn't the boring, typical kind of PowerPoint thing you have to sit through and then finally get to some interesting discussion. We're going to start with the sexy stuff from the beginning, so get ready. Wake up. So,
no pressure.
So I have to put on my glasses. So Hilary, just so I actually say all the right things, they've corrected the bios here. Hilary is a social entrepreneur, which I love that because we often obsess too much about the technological side of entrepreneurship. And we're incredibly happy that she's also a professor with us at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She's an internationally acclaimed social entrepreneur. Her work focuses on the collaborative and affordable solutions, but reimagining those solutions that address the big social challenges of our time. Innovations include a service to support employment in a time of digital age, a community model to support old age, and new approaches to support those living with chronic illnesses. And what's really important is that her amazing path-breaking book, Radical Health, which has also just come out in paperback, in other words, it's cheaper than it was before, is outside, and she is willing to sign your book if you promise to buy it. So don't steal it. If you buy it, show her the receipt, she will sign it. And Tom Loosemore is here, and he's a partner at Public Digital. And this is really important for me because we've also brought in one of his partners, Mike Bracken, into the Institute, and they together with Ben Terrett founded this amazing organization called Public Digital, which really rethought what it was for a government to have its own digital platform. Instead of having to access a white paper of the Department of Health through Google, the idea was that the government should itself have its gov.uk, which is what it became, digital platform. And to do so, they rethought what the citizen was. The citizen wasn't just a customer, a client, these boring words that we think students now are customers of schools, patients or clients of hospitals. They're users. And this user-driven innovation that they brought to the fore was fundamental. So he's a partner at Public Digital, which is a consultancy which brings governments and large organizations around the world to adapt to the internet era. And Obama thanked them. They even have a letter showing that. He has over 25 years of digital experience working at the Co-op, the BBC, Channel 4, and Wired magazine. In 2011, he co-founded the UK's government digital service, GDS, and wrote the 2012 government digital strategy, and then supported the digital transformation across government. And he was also really important for getting government to rethink seriously its universal credit scheme, and I think he's going to be talking about it a bit. And so now we're going to engage in a conversation, because I will shut up. And the idea of how we open up this conversation is really asking, what I would like to ask both Hilary and Tom, if we're going to rethink the welfare state, how can we make sure that we don't put this rethink in the hands of, I don't want to say the enemy, but those who actually have reasons to want to diminish the welfare state, also in terms of the power relationships. The welfare state was fundamentally also a powerful way to combat, if you want, the interests of big business and other actors in the economy. We don't just think perhaps about the delivery arms and how to rethink those. We must always be conscious of what the welfare state was for in the first place. So perhaps before rethinking it, what was it for in the first place? And was it such a big bureaucratic machine, or was it actually quite dynamic and creative, and now we just have to rethink that creativity?
It's a good question. I mean, for me, the important thing is William Beveridge, who, as you probably know, was the kind of author of the blueprint of the welfare state. He never in his life used the term welfare state. He didn't like it. He thought it sounded very sort of Bismarckian about kind of state control, and so he never used that term. And I think another kind of really interesting thing that's happened recently with that term is that Nicholas Timmins, who's the biographer of the welfare state, he has looked at where that term is used. And in 1997, something very interesting happened, which was that the Blair government took an absolute decision to split the term. And from then on, until that point, thousands of government papers were published every year with the term welfare state. And this is probably to your point about power. And from that moment, there were documents about welfare, bad, benefits, all those people who are scrounging. And there was a conversation about public services, good, health, education, very middle class. And that was a really important, I think, kind of split through there. So in Radical Help, in the book I've written, I go back to the original Beveridge vision, which was not perhaps the title of the welfare state, but a vision about flourishing in quite a sort of Aristotelian sense of what is a good life. And I look cradle to grave, what do we really need now to support us? And that has to be different to the original. It has to be more in some ways, because Beveridge he didn't think about adolescence, it didn't exist. He didn't think about older people, we didn't really exist. So it's a kind of an expansion, I think, of the term that's needed now.
Fantastic.
I know enough about welfare to be dangerous. And I think that in and of itself is important, because I know, other than Hilary, I don't think I know many people who do know enough about welfare, because you need to know the history. And having worked in government in the middle of a allegedly fundamental redesign of welfare, the history was lacking. What's the intent behind this originally?
So understanding of the history.
Understanding of why are there currently problems with our current system of welfare that we're trying to fix with our radical new scheme, but also what are we actually trying to achieve with our new scheme? What is the intent? And clearly that intent needs to change over time, as you've alluded to. But I also think it's right that should evolve over time politically as well. It is a political construct to some degree, the welfare state, notwithstanding there are those who would like to blow it up completely. So having, it only exists because of political agreement democratically. We could get rid of it next year if we voted that way.
What was the innovation? What was the welfare state, even in its original conception by the Beveridges, because there's not just Beveridge, that's the UK version. What was it doing? What was the innovation?
If you go back, it's the notion of a broad and reliable safety net in society to bring you back.
That sounds boring.
Broad,
reliable. Wasn't it more than that?
If you want the history, Hilary is the right person to go for there. But I think the sense that it is a re-enabler for people or an enabler, that is not present in the culture of the organisations running welfare in the UK, for sure. That notion that it is takes people from a place to another place in a positive direction, rather than, as you put it, this notion of sort of you've done something wrong even by being in this system, and this system will act on you.
Can I just check you guys for a minute before we go on to it, because you both are, I think, super social innovators in how to reform it. But to do that, as you're rightly saying, Tom, we need to understand what came before.
Yeah.
So before the welfare state, there was no welfare state, by definition, the word before. So what was it, what did it provide? I mean, just saying broad, reliable is, whatever. You kind of assume something exists to be broad and reliable. What was life like before the welfare state? What was the social innovation it provided? And was it just like an instrument, or was there real imagination? Was it kind of a breakthrough moment? Was it a social innovation itself?
Well, I mean, it was a long, organic process. I mean, job centres, for instance, were prototyped by Beveridge in the 1930s, and then kind of in the post-war period they were rolled out as a service. So he was in the East End experimenting in much the way that Tom and I and our colleagues kind of try to do today, and then he kind of built something. So the ideas were quite organic. I think what was important about definitely the vision was bigger. There was the idea, that we would have universal healthcare, universal education, everybody would have decent housing.
There wasn't.
Before it was extremely piecemeal. I mean, there was also, I can talk about how, in his third report, Beveridge talked about the mistakes he'd made, because also with this idea of kind of state provision and using the state to kind of roll things out in this kind of mass production way. I mean, of course, it was about, a new industrial revolution, kind of new technology. We could use it, we could harness it for social good. Some good and some bad came with that. But I think one of the important things, particularly when we move on to thinking about reform now, is that what Beveridge and his colleagues did was they created a framework, and they said, this is the vision of Britain. This is where we're going to go. If you want to be paid, basically, if you're a doctor and you want to be paid, you have to come into this framework, and you have to work in this way, and you have to provide at this level. And doctors, teachers famously loved it. Doctors were extremely reluctant. They thought that, they would kind of lower their professional esteem. But what happened was that this fundamental direction of travel was set, and huge social flourishing came out of it. So one of the kind of bigger questions now is, how can we reset that bigger framework? How can we, make sure that things grow rather than it's a kind of gradual taking apart? But not everything was new. That's my point.
I think you hit the word, which is what went before was piecemeal. I think there were a far more accepted place for non-government institutions in supporting people who needed supporting. That was less marginal if you look before the word. Yeah. But if you were in certain parts of the UK, good luck to you, frankly. Or if you were certain members of the population who are deemed to be less approved of, good luck to you. I think, and I take issue with your word reliable not being interesting. I think universality is massive, a massive deal. The fact that the commitment is there to serve everybody. Similar to the BBC existing, the big difference about the BBC, it's universal. It has to serve everybody. Okay, no one else.
Universal is a very exciting word.
But can I just say, yes, and hopefully we can discuss new universalism, but can I just say one other thing before we move on, is that there were big problems with this welfare state. For me, the biggest problem was care, that Beveridge had no idea what to do about it. He swept it under the front door, and he said, this is unpaid women's work. Women are going to take care of children, they're going to take care of old people, they'll take care of the neighbours.
Is that explicit?
Well, it's just a complete hollow. In fact, they had huge arguments about it. They didn't know what to do about it, what would fund it. It was kind of privatised, and it was made unpaid women's work. And so, I think kind of, we've all benefited from kind of different systems, but I think it's really important to acknowledge, and I think this goes to your first point, it's difficult in the current context to talk about this because there's so much fear it'll just be a kind of further stripping away of what we've got. But I think it's pretty important to acknowledge that there are kind of big holes in the welfare state, and if you're a woman, they're very, very big.
Okay, so I'm going to very soon, I've got this nice timer here, so I'm going to make sure I don't go on too long about this, but before we get to the changes, just a bit more on why it was important. Can you talk about, again, I mentioned power relationships. So, there's all this talk today about the 1%, the 99%, and it's not just talk, you see it in the data, in terms of just how much value in some ways is being extracted by a very small group of people, even though wealth and value is created fundamentally collectively, so nurses and doctors and school teachers And workers in factories, as well as managers and government officials and private sector garage chinkers, are all creating wealth. The fact that it then gets rewarded to a very small section of the population is what many people are writing about, from Piketty to others. So let's just talk a bit about that, because before the welfare state, I mean, the welfare state in some ways became almost not just a delivery channel, but it was also, in some ways, you could argue, a bargaining a vehicle to make sure that the wealth that is created by society through all these different actors also benefits society through improved public services, which are also universal, accessible, and high quality. So in that sense, it was revolutionary, right? And now it's really important to rethink it. We shouldn't just folklorically or romanticize it as, let's stick to the past. But that's really important, because any sort of rethinking of it should have just as a revolutionary role in terms of also distribution of these power relationships, because I want to come back to that later when you talk about your sort of solutions and policy proposals, perhaps. So would you agree that it was very important for these power relationships? And if so, how? Maybe some examples of what it did, especially you, Hilary, because you've looked a lot at the history.
Well, I think it's really important. So, I mean, Beveridge, in the beginning of the Beverage Report, he says, this is a time for revolutions, not for patching and mending. Okay. That's his beginning. Yeah. And that's what we should be saying now. Exactly. This is a revolutionary moment. Technology is changing our society in all the ways that you're talking about, and is driving these kind of deep inequalities, and we need to think about revolutions again. But something, I do think what preceded the welfare state is really important, because one of the stories that is kind of core to the kind of narrative I tell about the welfare state is that the experience of war meant that as a nation we got to know each other. People received refugee children that lived in poverty they'd never seen before. They kind of did fire service together. They were on the front line together. And, before this kind of huge shared experience, there was this narrative of the feckless poor, this idea that, these people, which we still have today. We know that most British people think that they have done well because they've got talent. They don't think that actually they were born in a kind of good family. We see it in all the work that Mike Savage has done, that, right. People think their children are very clever, but actually they've just come from families, with certain kind of social means. And we had exactly the same pattern before the war, and we came together in the war and we saw different things, and that was absolutely critical, I think, to building this kind of social consensus, this cross-party consensus that Tom was talking about, that enabled the welfare state to happen. And then, of course, the next phase that I think is really important, so that is missing at the moment, and then the next phase that's also missing at the moment is that then the welfare state is a big participative project. It really matters that we go to school together, that we queue to see the same doctor, that we're part of something. And in the original vision, of course, that participation was a social good. It was great that we were taking part. It wasn't kind of some service that was a cost that should be kind of minimised. No, it was a kind of investment in all of us and our well-being. So I think that that's another part of that story of kind of how we need to kind of rethink of those relationships before and within the services or not.
So maybe, Tom, you can tell us a bit about also your thinking and resistance to this concept also of universal credit in that vein, which is how you design then the welfare state fundamentally has to include not just the service that you're providing, but how it's being structured, how it drives a participation of the different actors in that, and perhaps how it can also be very disenchanting participation, which was central to what you guys did in GDS. But first, if you want to mention something about the universal credit work that you fought against in some ways.
Wow, I could talk for days, so I'll try not to. But the context is, actually, you had a moment in around 2009-10 where you had a broad political consensus that radical reform of work-related welfare, broadly scoped, was in everyone's interest. Everyone got fed up with just how complicated, complex, and inhumane, frankly, the existing accreted hodgepodge of welfare had become to be a claimant. So, claimant, there's a word. There's a word. God, straight back to DWP. To experience as a citizen. If you look back at the launch of various think tank papers, you had different people from different parties saying we want a radical different reform. And you had, even after the announcement of the 2010 result, obviously you had the coalition election aligned around universal credit. You also had Labour saying we support this idea. That's unique. And I think a false dawn, because...
And sorry, can you just clarify for those who aren't as versed in this, Universal credit instead of...
Well, there's a good question. Initially, it could have been up to a dozen different aspects of welfare, from job seekers allowance to tax credits to a housing benefit. Previously, those 3 welfare benefits would be administered by the tax authorities, your local council and DWP. So the ambition was a radical simplification and a much more responsive support for citizens who needed help to get broadly scoped back into work. It didn't include pensions and the like. And that notion that the time was right for radicalism and revolution was absolutely the narrative in 2009.
Well, yes, I would.
Maybe not your degree, but if you talk to politicians, they felt radical. You had other ministers saying, you maybe had ministers saying, don't do this. It's former ministers saying, don't do this. It's too radical, and they were probably right. In the event, three years later, I was asked to review universal credit. I had been in a different part of government. I joined a team of 6 or 7 people who spent several weeks understanding what had happened after 3 years, and about £500 million had been spent. Most of that money, interesting to your power dynamics, with IBM, Accenture, HP, usual suspects, okay? And 15...
Right, they were doing what? They were...
Well, very good question. Getting rich. They didn't pay the money back, that's for sure.
No, I'm serious. Like they were
ostensibly... they were ostensibly there to design the IT, as if that's a thing, okay? But bear in mind, there were also, well over 1,000 civil servants working on it. There were 3 very, very, and one of the things we discovered, there are 3 completely different cultures at work inside this supposed radical reform. One who saw it as a great opportunity to write a brand new policy document, and their ambition was to write policy, and there's a slide on here, I would hope, with 800 pages of... well, it's on rotation. There's a picture of the policy manual that was created, 800 pages of untested assumption, is what I used to describe it as, okay? That people in a committee room had decided was how people's lives should be lived and how you should apply economic incentives to people at the hardest point in their lives. You had another team who, frankly, I have more time for, who were working out how are we going to work this at the front line, this brand new thing, which was previously administered by local councils, hundreds of local councils, by the tax, HMRC, and by DWP. How do we operationalise this in the real world when we know the real world is very messy and not like people perceive it in policy committee rooms? Then you had 1,500 people in Warrington building a system. To what end, to what purpose? And if you ask those 3 groups, that's the document. That's part 2 of 2. That's just half of it.
Badly collated.
If you ask those 3 groups of people, those 3 cultures, which we did, what's universal credit for? Back to my point around intent, you got completely different answers. Right. And I think, when I say I don't know anything about welfare, I don't actually, because I don't think anyone can sit in a room and design a welfare system that they can hand over to someone else that will work give the same intent, same outcomes for the whole of the UK, and get it right first, second, third, fourth, fifth, millionth time, guessing in a room with no feedback loop. I mean, we've talked a lot about feedback loops in the past and the importance of iteration and learning from the reality of the world, not some hypothesis-driven, policy-driven nirvana where the cleverest person will come up with the best idea and then those nice men from IBM will build it and it'll all be fine. That's when I say I don't know anything about welfare. That method of designing welfare for people's difficult, complicated, messy lives. I agree. The same true with health, actually. These are complex areas.
But it sounds to me that what you're saying is also that these things aren't neutral. You don't just bring in the private sector to help do a bit. How they're brought in, what the relationships are, what the discussion is of what you're trying to build will determine the output of the system. This is something, by the way, that we in economics, at least the heterodox economics, say that money isn't neutral. The design of the financial system fundamentally affects what actually happens in the real economy and industry. And to me, this sounds like you're both kind of tackling it in different ends of how we design the welfare system, the way that citizens access these central, important aspects, which are basically often about human rights, right? Human rights to education, to clean water, to clean air, to actually being to participate in communities, not just have a public library to go into. So can you talk a bit about what you actually did? Because not everyone knows here. I mean, you guys are my heroes because I know what you did, but maybe starting with Hilary, if you can talk a bit about the social enterprise you ran and how you interacted with the communities and what that meant from a design perspective. Because you often talk about design.
What I want to say is yes, and I'm very happy that one of my former brilliant colleagues, who is an actual designer, Kate Byrne, is here in the front row, but and probably should kind of join the panel at this point. But actually, what I want to say is, we're now into the conversation about innovation and also power. Because just to kind of go back to that example, we can talk about, Kate and I did a lot of work together on work. So I think that. Tom, it's really interesting that you talk about the fact that in 2009 there was consensus about what should happen. But for me, that consensus was fundamentally misplaced. And what had happened had been a kind of wholesale swallowing on the left and the right of the kind of new public management textbook, which meant that, somehow we need to kind of re-gear these systems because they're not very efficient and we need to get people back to work. And if we kind of tinker, and we've got all the data about, salaries and kind of work, and if we kind of carry on tinkering in that data and in that system, we'll come up with a better answer. And actually, of course, the problem is like way further back. And so kind of trying to sort of put effort and time. I mean, we could talk all night, obviously, about universal credit and everything that's wrong with it. But just to go back to the kind of very beginning of the design, is that why was that being designed? What needed to be happening was a conversation about, look, the world of work is not the same as the 1930s when these original systems were designed. We don't have jobs for life. We're in this fundamentally different system. What completely different forms of support should we have? Let's think about how we can design those. And then also back to the sort of swallowing of the new public management textbook. I think what's really important about the different approaches we designed is that we don't see this as an individual problem. If you have got massive socioeconomic change in your society like we have now with technology, then you have got a whole nation, communities, trying to kind of navigate these shifts. So tinkering with a system and increasingly trying to individualize it is not where we're going to. So what we did was we started kind of, in the job centres, meeting people, going around for the second, third and 15th time, and started to think about what did they actually dream of? How could they get there? And it turns out, actually, first of all, one of the things that's really sort of obvious but critical in this work is that DWP is working at this tiny top of the mountain with economic data. Of course, it's this massive base of social glue that determines what you dream of doing, what you can do, especially in a kind of labour market where whether you can get a job in the first place or whether you can progress, which is much harder and universal credit doesn't even talk about, is basically down to who you know. Then we need a completely different form of arrangements that begins to think about how can I connect you to the next person that can help you move forward in your dream? How can I think about work in the broader context of your life and your family and also where you live? Do you live in a place where good work is even a possibility, or whether you're just going to move from one crap job to another? So I think the consensus actually was the beginning of the problem with universal credit.
I would agree.
So the lack of consensus, or the
total consensus. This idea that this was the system. Let's innovate this system. Let's think about how we can make the system, efficient and online for this. It's just
there was a desire. You're absolutely right. And the lack of disagreement was a fundamental problem. I won't speak for them, but when you got some of the people who designed universal credit, who they never thought it would get implemented. It was written on the back of a fag packet.
Mind you, so was Beverage. The Keynes came along and said, look, I can help you a bit with those calculations.
Fair enough, but
but that's interesting, because is it really the same thing? There's been social movements, right, to bring us progress, especially progressive progress, not regressive change in capitalism. So saying that the Beverage Report was kind of written on the back of a napkin, I think is a bit...
Well, but
but it's really important to identify if that was true or not.
Well,
because
if
it was true, then it's an elitist process. If there was a movement behind where Beverage then captures.
Well, all of those are true, but it is also true that when, various things happened. Of course, it was a kind of process of civil society, trades unions, church groups, everybody kind of coming together. But what was really important was that what Beverage did,
power relationships.
Yes, but what Beverage did was that he kept the story going at the highest possible level of vision. And every time people came back and said, you can't reorganise this organisation, he just kept the conversation up there, which meant that he didn't rely on existing data. Obviously, it wasn't, which is universal credit is well, we've got great data, let's reinvent with
But
the
I
data.
think can I just say, as a chair, I can just keep interrupting them. I know it won't bother me, but it's dangerous I think, to make the comparison you just made. Let me just give you an example. In IIPP, we work a lot with this concept of mission-oriented approach, right? That government should be having kind of bold, outcomes-based challenges like getting the plastic out of the ocean, getting clean cities, as opposed to just talking about the sustainable development goals and then doing nothing. And there's been different ways to do that. There's very top-down, elitist ways, as inspiring as the moonshot was. We're now in the 50th anniversary of it this year. It was very top-down, it was Kennedy and the gang, right? Whereas what's happening today in Germany, it looks kind of top-down. There's Merkel, she's the prime minister. She had this Energiewende mission to transform German society, but that came from 30 years of a green movement bringing to the fore the sustainability agenda. If it then gets packaged up by a politician, like in Germany around the Energiewende, to reduce the carbon footprint of the nation by actually reducing the material content, even of steel, that's fundamentally different from a top-down process that didn't engage with any movement. So the question is, even in the design changes that both of you are proposing, even yourselves as social entrepreneurs and innovators could almost be, seen as, I don't want to say elitist, but it's like your pet project. What we're really interested in is, where are the movements? How can yourselves as, I would say social entrepreneurs and intellectuals, as well as politicians, be the voice and package up in the most dynamic, interesting, innovative way what's really being requested, asked for, fought for by society?
I mean, I think there's so much to talk about. There's a
Come to dinner with us.
there is a challenge around that the movement, the conversation that didn't happen and hasn't happened and is not happening in this country around welfare is what's it for?
Right.
What's the intent?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the
Let's talk
outcome
about that.
we're actually seeking? And you can see this happening all over the world, actually. We do a lot of work with other governments, and a lot of work with Ontario, we've done some work with Finland, who both trialled UBI, Universal Basic Income, and they both stopped their trials before they've finished, really. And but they both measured the success of their trials purely on work progression. Not even work progression, getting people back into a job, whether it's a high quality job or a progressive job, is second order for
So that was
seemingly.
the target? They had
That's the
metrics
target. They got metrics, and actually the Finns, they actually got some data back saying it didn't make much odds. Ontario, they didn't even bother waiting for the end of the trial. They just got a new bunch of politicians in who dogma ruled, and they stopped the trials in Ontario. Two things to say on that. One, really, is welfare about getting people back into jobs?
Right.
Really? Actually, when you talk to people on the front line about what they do, they're most of the time supporting people's difficult, uncomfortable lives, stopping women getting beaten up by their husbands by pointing them to helping people with disabilities they don't even realise they've got to get support. Getting a job is often much later in the process. And actually those who get a job often get one by themselves anyway, and don't even need the support. And yet the whole political intent of both those two countries was get work.
So that's like Amartya Sen, who says you need the capabilities and opportunities to even
It's
reach
safety
the higher
net. Well, that's my personal political view. You need a safety net. And a safety net is not just about finding an easy way to get you, teaching you to search for a job or writing your CV better. They're second order. What I'd say about why I'm agreeing with you about new public management being a cancer at the heart of the public realm in the UK, is that question about purpose and mission. What's this welfare state for? I asked 100 times when I spent 9 months in DWP and HMRC. I got 100 different answers. Okay, there was no Beveridge going back to with a vision. This is what it's for.
And by the way, that's the same all the way down. I mean, you can ask, obviously I spend most of my time at the front line, you can ask nurses, social workers, and what they will show you is the outputs and outcomes that they've got to deliver. Deliverables. And they're like, no, but what do you actually do? What is actually going on between... And, this is not because they're not brilliant people. It's because they have been shoved into these systems where it's impossible to operate as a kind of sort of rounded professional that can actually kind of support the process of change that we're both talking about.
I think there's something important, though, about hubris here. I think, and you come back to your point around power, I think you've got to be powerful to actually do damage with hubris. And the damage that hubris has caused in welfare state in this country in the past 20 years is terrifying. And it comes down to a caste system in the public services in this country, where you have policy elite, the people who write the words at the top. And those people are divorced a very long way. They're lovely people, they're incredibly smart.
Can I tell a funny story?
They're a
about
long
this?
way from reality.
Can I just tell a story?
Yeah.
Don't forget, we can one tell a story.
I
That
wanna come back to that.
because when we
Yeah.
started our family work, one of my colleagues went into the number 10 policy unit, and they had this conversation. And at the end, they said, "Oh, thank you so much. These are the people you're talking about." And he said, but we haven't done any work yet. I don't really have anything to say. He's like, no, thank you, but you have a family and we don't. So you've given us an insight into kind of how that might be. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have a family to kind of design family programs, but at least having the knowledge. And I think this goes back to your question about design, and hopefully we can come back to
Yeah.
what are the
Yeah.
methods? How do you bring power in? But
Yeah.
sorry, I interrupted you. Go.
No, I want to talk about design. I think it's fundamental.
Can I
hard.
just then
Yeah.
provoke the question about design?
Yeah.
Because I want you now to both talk about what you've done, right?
Okay.
Not just this great new thinking that we need, but what you've done, and then we'll come back to the thinking. But to me, this concept of the elite, unless we're really specific on what we're talking about, is itself dangerous. Because you could still have kind of well-meaning people divorced from well, actually, you can't have them completely divorced. But the point is, what I think both of you have highlighted in your work in different ways is that it wasn't just a design problem, but the framing of, for GDS, what the citizen was, as I mentioned before, a client, a customer versus a user, fundamentally changed how you designed the digital service.
Yeah.
So you've talked about new public management, which I'm not sure how many people know exactly what that is, but if you can talk a bit more, what does it mean to talk about the citizen as a user and not a client, and how did that form what you guys did?
I mean, it's not new in the world I come from. I come from the internet. It's sadly, that mindset is how your Facebooks and Googles and Amazons get powerful. They use it for ill. I'd like to see it used for good.
Right.
And you start by understanding what's your intent. What are you trying to do here? If you're Google, you're trying to hoover up the world's information. If you're redesigning a welfare system, I'd hope you'd have a vision around that's broader than just getting more people into more work.
Right.
Which was actually, sadly, the vision behind universal credit.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a step that says, let's not assume we know what the answer is. Bunch of clever people with policy in their job title, writing a document, arguing in committee rooms, okay? Doing research, but reading other policy dictates. Because policy is not what's written on a piece of paper. Policy is the outcome of the experience that the citizen has from your service, your system. That's the reality on the ground. And the hypothesis that we push forward all the way through the government digital services start by understanding what needs citizens have off the back of your democratic intent. So, for example, if you have a democratic intent that this country has, which is very glibly, we want people to be safe when they drive on the roads. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's mostly the democratic intent. You would say, okay, we want to make sure that people's cars are legal when they're on the road and they're not unsafe and their wheels aren't going to fall off. The way we'd previously done that was by issuing them with a vehicle tax disc to make sure their car was MOT'd and da-da-da-da-da. And it ends up being a process of a bit of paper, doling out a bit of paper in the post office once a year and you have to go and queue. If you go back to what the user needs, they don't care about a bit of paper. They don't really care front of mind around whether their car's safe or not. They sort of do in aggregate. So understanding what their challenges are, you can design a system that is as frictionless as it can be, while enabling redress and democratic accountability if it goes wrong, which is what your Facebooks and Googles never have to do and never do. That mindset of an iterative, incremental, user need-led approach to incrementing your way towards a better policy outcome, ministerial outcome, was fundamental to how GDS, Government Digital Service, agenda in government and lots of other governments around the world, and we work with many of them now, following the same much more humble methodology that says you don't know what the answer is at the start. You can just about understand what problems your citizens have when they're trying to reach the outcome your democracy dictates is the right one, and you're going to iterate your way gently towards the outcome.
And what's so interesting about the GDS story is they ended up saving the government billions, I think 5.6 billion or something, without trying. It's very different to focus on efficiency targets, static allocative efficiency targets, and surprise, surprise, not reach them, because that's what you've been focusing on, from actually thinking big and trying to do what you guys did, and surprise, surprise, you actually become more efficient and save the government money because you were thinking of those systemic and
It's
user.
system thinking.
There's so much. Yeah.
I mean, it's yes.
But tell us about what you did. I mean, just because not everyone knows about the kind of different types of social enterprises you've set up and how you worked with people.
So I think that half of my life has been kind of, grappling with problems and designing things and solutions. But the other half has been constantly trying to find new methods that kind of really bring diverse voices and don't try to flatten them, because I think a lot of what we do is these days everybody goes and kind of has focus groups and talks to their users, but then somehow those voices still kind of get put in the great kind of industrial sausage machine, and the same thing still comes out at the end. So really thinking about what is it that allows kind of different people without power to really have their voices expressed. What that's about kind of methods, making things visual, talking about things in a different way. So a lot of it is about kind of very kind of basic methods that allow different conversations to happen. I think in most of the work I do, it actually isn't even clear what the problem is. Half the work will be thinking what the problem is. You're told what a problem is, but the problem is conceived in that system and probably isn't the right one.
And give us an example, because it's through the examples that we understand better, I think. So something of how...
Well, so let's take the challenge of adult social care, which is that there's not enough money in the system and there's too many old people, and what on earth are we going to kind of do about this problem? The first thing we would say is, is that really true? I mean, most wealth in this country is in the hands of people over 60. The problem is that it's not in the hands of the state and it's pretty poorly distributed, but there's an awful lot of resource. So let's think about that rather than the kind of tiny bit on the pin. And then the other question is it really true that we're all kind of having a terrible old age and there's not enough to go around? Actually, it's not true at all. Most of us are kind of living thanks to the welfare state, living kind of very, very rich older lives. And then there is a moment when we need support, and that kind of right support isn't there. So the problem as kind of set in policy is to kind of provide more better care. But when we started to kind of work with people over 50 and kind of hang out, playing bingo, having Sunday lunch, looking at things, what we saw was that actually what's missing is something much further back. It's really obvious. What's missing is kind of chances to kind of connect to people. What's missing is a response to get small jobs done immediately, because it's all still, everything that Tom describes, these kind of huge clunky 50 systems. The thing is that maybe we want to work but not in the same way. In fact, we want to kind of reimagine the kind of younger old age. And so what we saw was that, first of all, if you do that, to your point of saving money, is that if you create something there, you basically stop people going to kind of, people live a very rich third age, and they take much longer to get to the very expensive fourth age, which is great for the state, but much more importantly great for people, because you're having a kind of thriving life. But also, if you think about it in this much bigger way, what we did was we created communities which were open to people over the age of 50. And so then you have 50% of your members kind of full of skills, activity, resource that can support people who perhaps are more frail and able to kind of do things differently. And one of the things, this service kind of, which we started 10, some failed, some are still kind of growing and thriving. Basically, it kind of offers a sort of free phone number and then kind of on-demand social support and kind of practical support. And that has had the most phenomenal, not only are people having better lives, but kind of visits to GPs have fallen by 25% in these places, because you don't need to go and talk to your GP, you have somebody else to talk to. People are kind of living longer, kind of better lives. There's all kinds of data around it. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that it's not really a service. And I think that's really important, because one of the things that I hope we can talk about is that the future welfare state is not necessarily about services. We may need some services. We invented a great service that found people work and helped them to progress and work at a fifth of the cost. But a lot of the things we did were thinking about different forms of community model that support you in a different way, so you do not feel that you need a service. And technology has made this possible. Platforms, different kind of things can make us, enable us to connect in ways which perhaps we dreamt of in the 1970s and we had, but were at a tiny scale and couldn't be sustainable over time. They often relied on kind of one very charismatic person, which we don't need to do anymore. So we're able to kind of really Radical Help really tells a story of constantly turning things on their head in terms of what's the problem, what's the solution, and is it a service at all?
But is there the danger that if it becomes so idiosyncratic, where each problem has its own little specific way of solving it, and it might be community-based, that there isn't that systems thinking and systems understanding and scaling up, so it actually changes how we do the state, and the state as a vehicle through which you actually achieve greater level of democracy, but also services. I mean, just look at knife crime in London. How would you bring that to the thinking about that? You have youth services, which one could argue have been dismantled, underfunded, and even when they're saved, many of these youth clubs, for example, are cut, but when they're saved, they just become these boring arms of just kind of provide,
very
or
little
like
data
public
to show that
libraries.
you-
This
yeah.
wonderful building isn't necessarily connected as much as it could be with the public library system, which really should be the tentacles of the best that the 21st century has to offer. At best, sometimes they're a place where you have a room of your own to do homework. So what are you actually talking about when, I mean, what are the lessons to be learned in terms of the systemic way in which we change the tentacles through which the state can actually service, because I don't think the word service is such a bad thing. The problem is how you design that service to be as enriching, flourishing, this wonderful word that you use, as opposed to kind of, you know, capping any spirit in you.
So the
I
state
mean, why
has to,
change the word service? Why not just improve and to democratize the way that
we can
services
come back
are
to that,
delivered?
but to your question about the state has to set the framework, and now the state must step back in. It's kind of hard to think.
So you set the framework instead of what?
No,
invest?
no. We'll set a new framework. I mean, Beverage set a framework, and we're still kind of operating with a kind of diluted form of that framework. And what I'm saying is that the moment is now for the state to step back in with a new framework. Because you're saying, is it system change? Absolutely, it's got to be system change. And then, the state is like the head gardener. They say, this is the layout of the garden. Anybody who wants to garden can now come and garden, but these are the rules. We're going to garden like this, and we're going to kind of take the weeds out. So in Radical Help, I have got, I think it's somewhere here, and I have got kind of, 6 principles that would form that framework. The most important one of which, well, the first one is get a vision. Everything that Tom has been talking about, you can't start without that. If you don't know where everything you're saying. And then the second thing is this shift from managing people's needs. I mean, the welfare state has become this sort of industrialized process that sees us as parts that can go to a repair shop, and instead thinking about what are the capabilities we need to flourish in this century, and how are they going to be provided to make sure that, yes, of course, everybody has access. That's the setting, that's the architecture of the system. But then how that is done needs to be different for you, for me, for Tom, for Kate. That can be kind of thought in a different way. Okay. Within the guidelines, because that's what Beverage did. He said, this is it. If you want to play and be paid, you get in here, and if you don't, you disappear. And some good things were lost in that process, but that was the process.
So we're going to open it up. For some reason, this timer is going very slow. We have 13 minutes before we open it up to you guys. I might speed it up a bit and actually bring you in earlier than that, and we'll then have about 25 minutes to talk. But can I just ask you for the last 12 minutes here to talk about what your vision is of how, not if, how the private sector gets involved in any of what we're talking about? Because I think with GDS, it was so interesting what you did actually to disrupt the power of the incumbents, the Googles and the Ciscos, I think, in the space of how the state was doing digital. But then, of course, you're not saying that the private sector shouldn't be, but how? How can we make sure that, yes, they can provide bits here and there, but not actually direct the show? I mean, in many ways, the PFI schemes that have really been problematic in this country wasn't that the private sector got involved in health, is they ended up being able to direct what kind of health system we ended up with.
I think notwithstanding Hilary's point around a radical reset of the framework, which we can argue about, but let's assume there are still a range of services for which the state is responsible for. The thing that gets lost in all these neoclassical views of spending money to deliver services, the policy for which has been designed already. Policies don't get designed. Design is a process of feedback from reality. Okay?
That's what you're both constantly doing. Yeah.
A policy is written, and it's a first guess. If you then write a bunch of requirements, I've got a slide I think that comes around, that you then go and buy off a big old-fashioned IT company to build you a system, you then pay through the nose, sometimes millions of pounds to even change a word on that system from feedback, you're stuck with the power relationship being with one of 8 large system integrators, none of which are British. And that, the UK is spending about 16 billion a year on IT. Now,
Is or
well,
was?
they're not counting anymore, which is very frustrating.
Because they know.
That's very, very. There's a debate on Twitter today about the lack of counting of that number. But anyway, I think the shift that really needed to happen and I'm cautiously optimistic that is still happening in central government and some bits of local government, is an ownership by the state of the design of the service as experienced by the citizen. Don't need to write the code necessarily or design the graphics, and the private sector absolutely should have a role in that. But understanding that the policy only becomes real when it is used by a citizen, and having the capability to understand, to really understand, do we even understand the problem correctly, let alone does our first guess at a solution meet the intent that we're the vision we're trying to deliver. That was there in the 60s and 70s in the UK. You know, it's still, when we joined in 2010, design had disappeared, service design had disappeared. You'd come across these as a discipline, as an expertise completely. It was dots of it in places like Transport for London. You'd find these little enclaves of people who, the reason we've got nice tube maps is because there's still a service design function in TfL, thank God. Okay, they haven't outsourced that to Capita or whatever. Bringing that notion of designing, actively going through a process of designing services to meet an intent, and finding very, very different suppliers, preferably from people who understood how the internet worked, rather than how 1980s and 1990s
So
software.
why does different suppliers matter? You could just have one big, fat, amazing supplier. What is it about the quantity?
But they get lazy, and
Okay.
they get fat, and they give you the C team, and they get a power dynamic. It comes down to power. I mean, one of the things we did was introduce a digital marketplace to bring in, there's now 4,000 different suppliers, most of them SMEs. It's good for the economy, it's far more diverse, the money that's being spent. But more importantly, you're going to get better people, bluntly. Because you've got a wider, you're casting your net wider in terms of the specific skills you need. And procurement reform is something we end up talking a lot to governments about how you buy stuff, the way you buy stuff and what you buy is vital. I think that notion of design and service design being at the heart of whatever comes next, and a humble notion that you don't know what the answer is, you don't really understand the problem at the start, and iterating your way. I was very impressed that the Finns did something really radical in how they tried to do their UBI trials. And this is a question I have for Hilary, actually, which is one of the things I learned on universal credit is the really hard problem with welfare is not what's the future going to be, it's how do you move from where we are now to where the future is going to be without the world ending, without people falling into a chasm in the middle. And most of the problems with universal credit are people falling into the chasm from going from one system to another. What they did in Finland was, I think, really radical, which was they essentially handpicked 2,000 people across the country to represent the full diverse range of the country. They legislated for those 2,000 people, almost by name, to be part of the trial. And that wasn't comfortable for those people. They weren't too thrilled, I'd imagine, some of them. So they were taking a risk, but at least they found a representative sample and they treated it as a proper trial to understand what the outcomes would be, rather than trialling on the whole blooming nation with dogma driving behind it and trying to pretend it's a success. And they've stopped it.
Is it because you can't do the iterative thing when it's at that aggregation?
It's just not, you can, but it's incredibly unfair.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things we push for with you, and I'm glad that DWP did this, was to radically slow down they were determined to roll out universal credit. One of the things I'm very proud of is we persuaded them to go back and start with just 100 people. Throw everything they'd done away, essentially. Not that they'd done that much, to be honest. But start with just 100 people in a tiny bit of London and understand what actually happens to their lives before you scale out. Then go to 1,000 people in 2 job centres that are very different. So you get some stretch in the system. Yeah. Is it the same in Scotland as in London? Probably, to your point about when you walk around the country, people respond to your book differently. Should the welfare system be the same in different parts of the country? Maybe not. Maybe you could have 2 different welfare systems to represent the realities being different parts of the country.
So why don't you come in on the issue of the private sector,
Yes.
how it is integrated in your kind of thinking, and then we'll open it up.
Okay, so I mean, the private sector, as we know, is kind of heavily in the welfare state, with not just the captors, but I mean, if we think of something like adult social care, it's kind of, home care is 19,000 small, 90% of home care is 19,000 small organisations. I think almost all inpatient mental health care is actually private hospitals, even though it's all badged as the, so it's kind of already there. And I just want to go back to the most important thing, which is that the biggest privatisation is still the kind of assumption of mainly women's unpaid work and time. So this is like something that needs to be sorted as well. And I think that it's fine for the private sector to be involved as long as there is a kind of framework, so my vision is kind of a social economy where it's really clear what the rules are, what the mission is, what the values are. And then if you really want to kind of play within that framework, if you want to kind of join in and kind of provide adult social care, or you want to kind of support people into work, most of these things I don't think we should have, but if we have the kind of new versions of them, I think that's completely fine. But where the state has reneged is it hasn't been able to kind of design a new framework that works. So everybody has just kind of come in the way that, it's like the Wild West, isn't it? People who have kind of ridden roughshod over the state and over citizens, which is a kind of huge problem. So I think it's not that the private sector can't play a role, it's that the framework has to be very different. And then hopefully, community groups, Beveridge really, really was distraught with the welfare state by the time he died, because he thought that his framework had written out community groups, voluntary organisations, and it had become overly statist. So all of this kind of needs to be rethought. But the last thing, I just want to say that there is only one group that I think should not be allowed to be part of it, and this is consultants. I think, and I'm not joking, basically, I think that this is about power and it's about knowledge. And if you have a whole industry whose job is to go in, extract the knowledge and take it somewhere else, leaving absolutely nothing behind, that this is not allowed. This kind of extraction is definitely not in the values or the mission of any welfare state. So those are the only people, I'm afraid, that I have got complete sort of wrath for. But other than that, everybody's welcome. Yeah. Let's make the world a better place.
Apparently 4 consulting companies are running Brexit, so that also shows how well they manage these processes. But that's really interesting you say that, because there is, this expression, learning by doing. And in some ways, the state has stopped doing many things. It's been outsourcing, whether it's to the private sector or to consultants, think tanks, sometimes academics, stuff that they're doing. So aren't the two things related? If you have actually a vision for something, you also want to do it. As soon as the vision of what the state is for, it becomes easier to think that you can just outsource different bits. If you're not seen as one of the value creators, but just enabling, facilitating, de-risking others to do stuff. So I personally don't like the word enabling environment, because the idea is that you're just enabling it for someone else to get their hands dirty. And the idea that, this is very much goes to the center of what IIPP is about. Unless you're also part of the action, you not only don't do, but it becomes this vicious cycle that you yourself become kind of stupid and irrelevant, and surprise, surprise, everything gets outsourced and privatized. And so are there also some areas that you actually think are kind of hands-off? Public education. Is there any real role for private education in a system where public education isn't just free education, but as soon as some people start to opt out, you don't also get that kind of consensus, the different voices of what education is for? In this country, there's even a different curriculum. Many kids in the poorer parts of the country don't even get access to philosophy, right? There actually aren't philosophy classes in some state schools. In the private schools, you have that. Is there that if you don't have a vision for something?
You're providing something different, aren't you? You're not saying, no, because we're saying schools are like this. And, so those schools are running on a different economy, they've got different money, they're providing.
But if you're saying frame, shouldn't the frame, what's the point of having education if actually we think, it depends, you're not as, because you're disadvantaged or whatever, won't have access to philosophy. Shouldn't we just have a national curriculum that's available for everyone?
Of course.
So what's the point of having a private?
Well, I think they would drop away, but my point is that if you had a framework, let it be decided. You don't need to have this kind of head-on battle with the private sector. What you need is a radically different framework. And I just think because...
So there's no areas that you think should be kind of fully public, and just having lots of different voices of what that public is for.
Well, look, the thing is that I imagine that it's going to be public, because if we actually have the correct framework and you don't have a kind of possibility of profit in there, different things are going to happen. Of course, that's going to be part of the framework. But I don't think what's happening at the moment is that we're really wasting time talking about, should it be public, should it be private, is it about the money? Whereas, Tom has been so powerful, I think, about this, and it's so, important, which is that what's the vision? Well, the vision is kind of this different public vision of who we're going to be as a nation. Oh, so how interesting, suddenly the private sector aren't so interested because they're not able to financialize those services. But I don't think we need to kind of have the conversation at that vision level, not at that kind of lower sort of Punch and Judy level.
I think there's been there's an interesting immediate example, which is the probation service. There's a very interesting thing in some ways. It's when you look I haven't looked desperately deeply, but I've looked enough to know that the nature of the contract was quite new, in that it really was about some very, very specific outcomes and intents, which rather than you will follow this process and turn this handle. How they ran the probation service was broadly, there were some boundaries, but broadly scoped within the hands of the private providers. And my word, didn't they mess up? And isn't that interesting? You know, and whereas a previous way of doing that would be to say, here is our process, here are our requirements, you go and follow that process and requirements, and we'd have been stuck with them for years. They wouldn't have failed quickly enough. We would have still been responsible because we'd given the requirements. Now, you enter payment by results, terrifying territory there quite quickly, and but I'm interested about how quickly that failed as a model, and that for me is a positive. And the fact they're bringing it back, I'm delighted about, because I personally think probation is one of those things that
should remain public.
Yeah.
Good. So now we have 30 minutes. I don't know how this works of discussion. So we'll take 3 questions at a time. We have, I think, Lucas and just Lucas bringing around the microphone. Let's just get a show of hands. One in the back there. Come on, raise your hands, or we can all just go have a drink. 2 in the back there. Yeah. Oh, and sorry, the rule is you stand up just because this is also being live streamed and we want everyone watching it to hear and see your question. But also please just say who you are, maybe where you're coming from.
Good evening. Thank you for the talk. Patrick Lee is the name. As may be obvious, I'm a pensioner of some years, so I was one of the first beneficiaries of the National Health Service. Fascinating discussion. As a non-academic, whilst I found it interesting, amazing work being done, I've still got a yawning gap which it hasn't really been addressed. It's quite a simple one. All the innovation in the world is not going to change the yawning gap between public expectation on what public services will provide them and what they're actually prepared to pay for. Let's take the National Health Service, for example. We want to have immediately amazing life-saving operations. We want them into our old age, into our 80s and 90s, which Beverage could never have envisaged. But the simple fact is, no one appears to be addressing the question. Having had no end of innovations, how do you persuade the public to allow public services, or the proportion of the GDP spent on public services, to go up quite significantly? Because if you can't do that, the rest falls by the wayside in mere points of detail.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take 2 more, and then I'll ask you guys to answer whichever ones you want. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ella. I work here at the British Library, and I actually work on a project with public libraries around the UK. But I was really interested in what you were saying about groundswell and kind of hierarchies of power in terms of mission-oriented ideas and kind of driving forces. And I suppose I was just interested in you were talking about the moon and Kennedy and the different way in which that worked in those 2 examples you gave. And I suppose I just wanted to know what examples you might know or have come across of examples where energy is coming from people and moving up in that way, and also how and what the mechanisms are for that. And I suppose a kind of follow-on question actually is, you spoke quite a lot about vision and the need for that kind of clarity, and I just kind of wondered, how does that relate to all those dynamics of power which are playing out? And I just would,
vision?
Yeah, and I just wondered if I would just be interested to hear more about that.
Great. Okay, we'll take a 3rd question and then.
My name is Karen Jewett. I'm from Croydon. I'm a local government councillor, and I'm also chair of the local co-op party. So I can guess where you're coming from, and you can guess where I'm from. Just one thing that the guy said at the back about the NHS and about what we want. I don't know anybody who would say they wouldn't put another £1 a month or 10 pence a week, God help me for saying it, into the system to help pay for the National Health Service. We need to stop, I think, as a country, that tax reduction is the only way that you can stay in power. You don't. You do that at the. You ruin everybody else's life by grabbing the power that you think you're going to have. The other thing that I find, because I also work with older people, because people think that when you're a counsellor that's your job. Well, it's not. I need 2 jobs to be able to afford to be a counsellor. And you were saying about about women and women's work at home. Years and years ago, when women could retire at 55 on the back of their husband's pension, or when everybody was married and nobody got divorced or nobody stayed single, and that's all gone. I have to work till I'm 68 before I can pick up a pension. So all these people that this big society and the government's dependent on to run the voluntary organisations are not there. And by the time I retire when I'm 68, I'm not going to be fit to be able to run their voluntary organisations. My volunteers are in their 80s. The people who are younger than that are still at work because they can't afford to live if they don't go to work. So we need to, what I'm going to ask is, how do we change this so that people can have more, it's not necessarily leisure time, but more time to do things in their community that they might want to do in their community, but without being penalised financially for it. Because I do think that we do need to put the taxes up. We need to pay for stuff. And as a Labour Party member, it probably chokes me to say it, but we need to look at the bigger picture, and we cannot survive on low taxes, and we certainly cannot survive in giving the richer less tax to pay than I'm paying.
Okay, thank you very much. So do you want me to remind you, or you're good?
The question is there's so much to say.
Tom, why don't you begin, and then I'm happy to address the moonshot one.
I think there's two really valid points about the NHS and the model being really under pressure. 2 things there. One is I'm frustrated by the lack of enough of an honest conversation about what the edges of the NHS should be. When should we not actually fund stuff? And I think the hardest job in the UK at the moment is chairing NICE, which is the committee that decides what drugs are going, and that's an impossibly hard job. So that is a question for me, and where's the honest conversation there? Well, you get it from Simon Stevenson, who's not a politician. He's he's a manager, essentially. Politicians of all parties have stepped away from that debate. It's too scary for them. But I'd also make a point about, it comes to the point that Mariana mentioned around saving money. I don't think throwing more money at things, that's not saying they don't need more money, but starting the conversation by this needs more money and throwing more money at a system that's not working well doesn't always give you the outcomes you want. And I would be as interested in understanding how can we, and there is some interesting work starting to happen in the NHS, how can we actually make sure that the gaps in the healthcare system that drive cost and inefficiency and pain on many levels are actually designed away, so we actually, every pound we spend is more efficiently spent, because I don't think that's the case at the moment. And throwing more money at a system that is fundamentally broken in different ways doesn't always give you the outcomes you want, is my challenge. It's not to say I don't think we should be spending more proportionally on the NHS. I think we do, but not currently as it is it would be my sense. Just a second question around movements. I can see one, the world I'm in, I can see one happening, and it's happened really quickly, which is a rebellion around my data against the Googles and Amazons and Facebooks. And I remember having conversations not 3 years ago with friends at Facebook and Google who had no fear of regulation, no fear of the state's death, didn't feel any sense that the politicians were going to take them on. My God, that conversation is different now. And all politicians do are following a movement there. That's not driven by brave politicians. So it can happen, and happen quite quickly. And to your point around how do you reset that relationship, how do you get that extra time, I think there's something really interesting about the notion of it comes to the point that you made around women caring for people, that that is unpaid, that volunteering work is unpaid and unrecognised by the states, is really interesting. Just a little anecdote from Universal Credit days. Big part of Universal Credit was, you really, conditionality. What do you have to do to prove that you're looking for work? Okay, I don't know if you remember, but people were forced to go and work for free. Yeah, in charity shops, right? All wrong, always
Bill
up.
Clinton introduced this
All
in the US.
wrong, always up.
Workfare.
Okay.
Workfare.
Why not support people who follow their direction and what they're volunteering in? Maybe they set up their own new volunteering group, and you recognise that as a valued pathway into supporting themselves more over time. That thinking is totally absent from that notion of understanding and measuring, even to your point. The voluntary activity that people give is totally lacking. I've got to wait. If I retire at 68, I'll be delighted. I can see that changing again and again now.
Yeah, so I also want to kind of start with the NHS and also maybe kind of give some answers that are a bit more practical, because I'm not actually an academic. I mean, I'm kind of out there building stuff, but I also, when we do the work, we never start with the money, because that really narrows the conversation down. And I think, it's really important that 70% of the money in hospitals, for instance, is spent currently on people that can't be cured and can't even be well cared for in hospital systems. So we know that putting more money into those systems isn't going to solve it. We also know, and this is back to Mariana's kind of very first starting point, is that we have so few positive models of what an alternative might look like, that everybody, even though they know the right thing isn't to defend the system, MPs immediately rush to defend their hospital if it's going to be closed, even though behind closed doors they talk about the fact that the answer isn't more hospitals. And that's because the only thing we can envision at the moment as a nation is cuts or what we've got, so we're going to kind of look after what we've got. But what we need is, a kind of massive national experimentation, as happened before the welfare state, with very different models, particularly concentrating on very different forms of support for older people and chronic conditions, because it's just horrific to be in the NHS with those kinds of. It wasn't designed for that. It's sucking out the resource, and all the models we design around kind of chronic conditions in the community are, of course, cost much less and also take care of you. So I think it is probably true that we'll end up having to put some money in, but we need to kind of completely rethink the system first. And then I also think people are kind of quite willing to kind of contribute to different systems that they feel work and they're part of. To the question about energy, I just want to tell a story about Wigan. So one of the first, we did quite a lot of family work, and one of the first family projects we did, working with families who are kind of suffering kind of multiple forms of disadvantage with hundreds of welfare systems in their lives, not making any difference. And one of the first places that we started this work was in Wigan. And it was kind of very successful. We basically asked all existing public service workers to stand back, and we asked families what support they needed to change their lives, and then we worked kind of very gradually with whatever they chose. And to Tom's point, eventually they kind of thought about work and school, but we started where they were. And then Wigan kind of they were very excited by this, and then they kind of replicated it with their adult social services, similar kind of thing, and then the cuts came. And they realised that they couldn't possibly, Wigan is a Labour council that lost a kind of, I never hold these figures in my head, but an unbelievable part of their budget was lost. And they realised that they just couldn't possibly cut, that they needed to think again. So they went to those models that we'd started, and they said, what would happen if we reorganised everything in Wigan around those values? And so actually what they did was they took the core values that we had gone with, and they re-interviewed, because they had to lose so many people, they re-interviewed everybody in Wigan. Whether you were a social worker or in the HR department, you kept your job according to whether you were kind of part of those principles. And then they told this very baggy story. I mean, I could tell a lot about storytelling. Beveridge was important because his story was quite baggy and people could see themselves in it. And they called it the deal. And they said, this is going to be a new deal between the state and the citizen. And what has happened in Wigan, it's just so incredible in terms of kind of how they have rethought things sort of up to the boundary of the law. I'm sure they don't do anything illegal, but whatever makes sense they do. Like for instance, they discovered that they are fostering children out of borough, which is, really expensive and really awful for children. And so they went to their kind of brilliant foster carers and they said, why don't you take more children? And the foster carers said, because we haven't got room for them. And they were like, right, okay, we'll build the extra rooms then in your house. We'll give you an extension. So whatever it takes to kind of think people out. But what I find really amazing when I go to Wigan is when I ask people about it, they don't say, oh, my school is now great, which, it is. What they say is, oh, I saw Tom at the bus stop and I realised that he couldn't carry that shopping home. So I realised that I should just stop and kind of pick it up and help him. And I wouldn't have done that before the deal. And so what's happened is with this kind of big baggy story, this whole massive movement of change has happened that Wigan haven't been part of actually, but by kind of creating that framework, other things came. And the final point that I want to say about this is that one of the things that I think in the work we did at Participle that I kind of write about in Radical Help is that with Circle, the ageing service, for example, we would go to local authorities and say, would you like this model? And they would look at the business case and they would say, oh, well, we can see this is saving tons of money and we really believe this. But the thing is here, people are never going to participate. Nobody participates here. And in fact, our most flourishing circle is in Rochdale, where, I don't know if you, but McDonald's had just left the day before. They'd packed up because apparently there was no cash in the economy in Rochdale. And people had to kind of make some initial very small contribution. They were like, that's not going to happen, and people aren't going to give their time. Every single place we've gone to date, that hasn't been the case. Because actually, of course, we don't want the big society to be told that we've got to put our library books back on the shelf now because now there's no money for it. But if something is designed, and again, this is a technology point, I think, to use little bits of people's time. If something is designed with the grain of people's lives and people feel ownership, they want to do it. Because although you said you can't volunteer, I mean, you're a local councillor. What's that if it's not? Well, I mean, you're an amazing volunteer. So the thing is that of course it is happening, but it's very, very difficult for it to happen at the moment. And we need to design ways socially so it's with the grain. But also, of course, we need to rethink work, which is kind of the new project that I want to do kind of, at IIPP. So that bit is coming. I'll come back next year. I'm doing it. That comes next year, but yeah.
I just want to, before I open it up again, address the issue of this moonshot and who decides whether it's really participatory or top-down, that example I gave of kind of Kennedy versus what Merkel did. First of all, in IIPP, one of the things we talk about is, do we actually have the capabilities, the capacity within the public sector, because of the whole new public management and public choice theory, brainwashing of what the civil service is for, to actually listen. People don't just wake up and know how to listen and really participate in a stakeholder kind of way. You also need training in that. Just like people are trained in maximizing shareholder value, you need to be trained also as a policymaker, as a politician, to listen and to work in that iterative style. And for that, what's really interesting is we're working now in the Basque region of Spain, which is an interesting place where we're about to begin with the project funded by Climate Kick, hopefully, because it's an area which has a very large company. Right? So when we talk about business, public sector, third sector coming together, well, what kind of business do we actually have? What kind of public sector? They have a very large company called Mondragon, which actually has 80,000 employees. And it's, I was going to say, it's a cooperative. She beat me to it. It's like John Lewis. By the way, Huawei is also a cooperative. I always tell them, remind people you're a cooperative. But anyway, we can talk about this another time. But so being a cooperative, it's actually institutionalized this whole issue of how do you bring different voices to the table? How do you get a share? How do all the people that are contributing to the wealth creation process of that company get a share in that wealth, which is fundamentally different, by the way, from the narrative, for example, that UBI, in terms of society, the Universal Basic Income, has, which is kind of a handout, right? Wealth is created here, and then it's hounded out over there. That was the whole point of setting up this series. How we imagine the service, the state, the kind of health we want, the imagination around education, drive innovation. So if we can actually work in the way that Tom was saying, in particular places, in this case in the Basque region, to look at how governance of the organizations in the business sector, governance of the policy programs actually ends up forming how we bring different voices to the table. It's not just the usual rhetoric of business, government, civil society. I think there's a whole missing area of that, and how do you say, sandboxing, experiment around that. The second thing is, one of the artists that we've been working with in the Institute is Olafur Eliasson. You might remember he did the big sun at the Tate and the big turbine hall. He actually defines public space, because we all think we're in a public space just because it's free to walk into, like the space behind, say, Granary Square here. He says public space is a space where you're actually safe to disagree. So one question is, do we actually have the spaces and the institutional forms where people really can bring together fundamentally different ideas about what these missions might be, whether it's what libraries are for, whether it's the moonshots around sustainable cities. And I think not, actually. I mean, we need to be thinking of institutional innovations, social innovations, as much as technological innovations. And in some ways, the welfare state, as we've been talking about from the beginning, was a massive social innovation. Mm-hmm. Trade unions were an incredible social and institutional innovation. So what's the equivalent of that today in, for example, the data, platform capitalism, economy? And I think that's just as much of a question as much as tinkering on the delivery channels. And in some ways, I often ask that to trade unions. What is the equivalent of the weekend also that you're going to be fighting for in the future, as opposed to just defending yourself against these things that are being decided elsewhere? We have 10 more minutes. Do you want to, so one in the back there, one here, and the lady there in the cream-colored coat.
I should stand because you won't be able to see me otherwise. Pratik Butch, formerly actually of your parish, Tom, GDS, but currently today here with colleagues from the National Leadership Centre, which is a new thing set up at the Cabinet Office. That'll hopefully give you a clue about my question. So between you kind of talked about systems thinking, you talked about community-driven support, you talked about a dynamic reimagined public service. I'm interested in what the role of leadership in that new public service might be. No, hang on. I think it's probably fair that the leaders of today and tomorrow need to be more diverse and dynamic and connected and risk takers. How are we going to get there? The leaders in these organisations enjoy that power dynamic. How can we get them to be leaders of a reimagined public service? That would be good to hear from.
Since you're already there was the lady here, and then we have someone here who had their hand? Yep, in the back there.
Hello, my name's Eileen Smith. I was a nurse. I was a Bevan nurse. I started when Honora and Bevan started their National Health Service, and I'm absolutely fuming. I may be stepping out of line. I'm absolutely fuming at some of the comments that are being made about the NHS, because I don't know whether people realise that at this moment we are moving to privatisation. And what's happened is millions of pounds have been spent on private consultants. You mentioned consultants. These private consultants have moved in and they're just stealing money from the NHS. And the whole point is that Simon Stevens, who used to be the boss of United Health in America, is deliberately privatising our health service, and nobody seems to realise what's going on. What they need to do at the moment, instead of this massive reorganisation, is to recruit GPs. They have deliberately run down the training programme of GPs. So we're very short of general practitioners. Recruit more general practitioners, pay them more. We don't need this massive reorganisation that they're spending millions on. Leave it as it is, but recruit more GPs. I could go on, but I'm just sort of so full of anger about the whole thing that, maybe I just better stop there.
No, very good point. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Roy Warden. I used to work for HMRC and I worked with GDS colleagues. I now like to describe myself as a global citizen. I want to draw your attention, and this won't end up as a question, but I just wanted to draw your attention to a very interesting phenomenon that I'm now quite a big part of, and that's park run. I don't know how many people here are familiar with this, but 9 o'clock every Saturday morning, 250,000 people at thousands of locations around the world get up, go to and do a 5-kilometre run. Some of them run to beat their personal best. Some run just because they like it. It's a wonderful community. These events happen because of the efforts of volunteers. None of this was designed by the state or a public institution. I don't think anybody actually had a vision for what it was going to be. It just happened because 2004 in Bushy Park, 15 people got together and had a run, and from what turned out to be very successful, it has grown enormously with huge benefits for people's health and for people's mental well-being.
And the question is? What do they think about it? Okay. Oh, you said that. Good. Okay. So leadership and
leadership.
undercutting of the NHS through these private consultants fund more GPs and don't rethink the whole thing. And let's go for a run.
Leadership. Wow, where to start? I think you need to really... One of the most impressive things I've ever seen a leader do was Greg Dyke when he was Director General at the BBC. I'll start there. I just joined the BBC as my first senior job, I suppose. The very first thing he did was invite in an anthropologist for a year to study the BBC as if you were discovering a new culture in a new island. And she presented her results back at a sort of leadership event, and it was amazing. The first thing she did, and the only thing that really landed, was here's the actual power structure in the BBC, the actual power dynamic, not the theoretical hierarchy, the actual power dynamic. And right down the bottom were the cleaners, sadly. Right down near the bottom were anyone in any task that was vaguely technical, even cameramen and people like that. And actually, you get to like the directors of the BBC; they're kind of in the middle. Actually, they're not they're not that powerful. People who were really powerful was the talent, which is Jeremy Clarkson's, and the people who were next talent were those who were sleeping with the talent. And she actually said this, and everyone in the room laughed, and I suddenly realised the BBC was not the kind of place I thought the BBC was. Anyway, I think when you ask the question about what's the future of leadership, you need to do that exercise in the civil service and understand. I've got my own theory, having viewed it, about where the real power dynamics die. But if you ask a mid-level civil servant how you get to the top of the UK civil service, they'll tell you very precisely which different bits of the civil service you need to work in which different jobs, and you know it, okay, and that breeds a monoculture of leadership at the top that is very, very hard to break, and because those people only hire people in their image and blah blah blah. Having said that, I am very hopeful of bottom-up change at the same time as being despairing of that dynamic. I think there are some interesting changes happening in the UK civil service, which are bottom-up. There's a genuine movement, which is now global, called One Team Gov, which is about how do you actually work horizontally across different bits of government, how do you actually share expertise, how do you get beyond departmental boundaries, how do you actually become a movement for a much more humble, iterative, blah, blah, blah. That's really exciting, really interesting how quickly they got co-opted by permanent secretaries. It's really, it's such a threat to them, they threw money at it, okay? So, and they've not co-opted it, which is interesting. So in the medium term, I think it's quite exciting what's going to happen. There's going to be a moment. But I would first of all have an honest conversation around where power really lies, because it's not in the hierarchy at all. Your point about hiring more GPs and the NHS being privatised, I don't know enough about the detail. What I do know is to Hilary's point, tons of it is privatised at the moment, and we don't even know it. And I'm not totally convinced that's all bad. I've actually been a recipient of NHS branded private care that I didn't know was private care, only found out afterwards, and that was fine by me. What I would say is, I think being a GP now is far more stressful than it was. And it's far more stressful because the kind of ailments that people have today and the expectations people have are much harder to deal with than maybe they were. And it comes down to public expectation. So I do think hiring more GPs is the right answer. Part run, I think part run's really cool. The reason part run's really cool is because they didn't sell it. Okay, there were loads of people tried to buy part run. I tried to buy part run when I worked for the co-op. I know that because I thought it was a brilliant cooperative thing, right? Bottom up, not for the selling. That's really interesting. And I got a letter through that notion of we are creating a movement here that is not. We could monetize this, but we're not going to because the value is in the public realm, not my personal private realm. Is really interesting. I despaired at a letter I got through the post a couple of weeks ago from an organisation a commercial company called Nextdoor, Yeah, anyone had next door letters? It's written as if it's to me personally, saying, "Hey, there's this new
I've had one of
community,
those,
online community set up in your area. Come and join it." It's a private company trying to monetize public space, to your point. And the fact that there isn't, that is happening and VC money is going to that, I despair of that. I'd much rather see a park run, but for my street, at scale, using all the scale effects that park run does brilliantly.
Residents Association, that's what you need.
Yeah, but you know,
So I mean, I suppose the thing about the leader is, you know, it's the ancient Chinese thing. The leader is the one of whom they say we did it ourselves. And in the work I do, that is the model of leadership that we are espousing. And in the third part of Radical Help, I have a whole, you know, thing about transition, about what it actually takes to get from where we are now to that, which I don't underestimate, but that's where we need to go. I'm so honoured that there is a Bevan nurse in the. Please come and shake my hand afterwards. It's kind of amazing that you may. Oh well, yeah. If you buy the book, I'll even be more. But anyway, it's really lovely that you're here, and I'm so pleased that you said what you said. I think that the biggest challenge is that good people can't work in bad systems, and the GP situation is partly a political rundown, but it is also because it is impossible to be a GP now, and it isn't just public expectation, it's the horrific systems in which you have to work, the conditions, the risks, and it's the same, you know, a third of midwives aren't working, most schools, there's massive gaps for head teachers, social workers, you know, people cannot work in these systems. We have amazing professionals, and we need to kind of completely rethink what are the systems of support around them, and begin to challenge the things you're talking about. And you've made me feel guilty because I haven't done Part Run for ages, but I do think it's the most incredible thing.
But I think what's really interesting, what Eileen said, at least my interpretation is, I mean, what I see also in the community where I live in Camden is it was a purposeful attack on these structures. It's not just that there's something, you know, deterministic about kind of 21st century capitalism that these jobs somehow get decimated and are less interesting. They were made to be much less appealing and difficult if you look at how Ofsted in some ways is working.
That is only partly true.
Trump, by the way,
in my book I have 1960s studies of nurses, and it was always very stressful, and it is absolutely.
So one thing that a taxi driver once told me, which is very interesting, because then I asked around and verified it, which is that one of the things that happened also in many estates in London is that the caretakers used to be not only properly funded, but they knew the people living in the estate. So if a young child, and I've got 4 of them, they all do really stupid things. If they did something stupid, they would yell at the kid and say, "I'm going to tell your mother," so get back and stop doing it. Now they just call the police. So these kids, you know, because they're outsourced, they don't live there, they don't know the kids. And the irony is it doesn't necessarily cost less. It often costs less, so there is that whole austerity thing. But the way you attack the state is you go after its ambition, you go after its structures, you go after not only the democratic participation in that caretaker kind of way, but the interesting thing with Trump, when he came in, the first thing he did, literally the first week in office, the guy is not stupid, this was very strategic. People laugh at him, but he's very smart. You go after the state, not just through austerity, that's one view of what, you know, how you attack the state. You go after its organizational capacity. He went after public broadcasting, the equivalent of BBC. He went after ARPA-E, which was the state's arm to tackle kind of climate change, and basically said that they were too big, too ambitious, just go back to your little corner. And he didn't actually cut the budget of these areas. He went after, you know, attacking the intelligence, the organizational kind of DNA, what these organizations thought they were for. And that's, in some ways, how the welfare state itself has been decimated. So not only rethinking its arms and its delivery services, but kind of bringing back that ambition, that confidence, as well as the budget. Let's not dismiss the massive budgets that have been cut in the communities at every level, but map out this attack is not a stupid thing to do in order to rethink itself, because otherwise we're just being naive. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. There is a bar outside. It's a fantastic bar. And a book, a beer and a book, BB. And thank you very much.